Following a full day of fighting on September 19th of 1863, both armies bedded down for the night, anxiously awaiting the next attack that was sure to be coming at first light. Throughout the night, soldiers on both sides were exposed to the elements. Fires were prohibited due to the armies being in such close proximity. Men huddled together for warmth as the screams and cries of the wounded filled the night air. One soldier, W.B. Smith of the 37th Georgia, along with a few comrades, tried to make the best out of this tough situation. Earlier in the day, Smith and a few others captured haversacks filled with ample food. Despite being ordered not to have fires, Smith and his comrades formed a small semicircle and started a fire just large enough to cook some meat.
On reaching behind me to cut a stick and throwing one foot out to the right, I felt something heavy clinging to my shoe. Holding my foot up to the fire, I discovered a double handful of men's brains sticking to it. Under other circumstances, this could have spoiled our feast, but we had become so used to horrible sights that it would have taken worse than that to choke off an old Confederate. W.B. Smith, 37th Georgia.
Commanders from both armies also took this time to review their plans of battle. With several fresh divisions arriving, Confederate General Braxton Bragg maintained his current plan: keep up the offensive and turn the Union flank. However, Bragg also made a major change to the structure of his army. Frustrated by the lack of coordination amongst his high command, Bragg decided to split his army into two wings. General Leonidas Polk would command Bragg's right wing, while General James Longstreet would command Bragg's left. Polk's wing was ordered to attack at sunrise, with John Breckenridge's division leading the assault. Come nightfall on September 19th and into the early morning hours of September 20th, both sides would hunker down for a very long, cold, miserable night, sleeping amongst their fallen comrades. Come daybreak, the welcome warmth would only mean one thing: more fighting. So we have reached our first stop, and today we're going to be covering the fighting that took place here in Chickamauga on September 20th of 1863. Now, just through the trees here is the Visitor Center. Here is the Lafayette Road, and then the famed Florida Monument here. And we are in a field that would have been part of John McDonald's farm at the time of the battle. Now, we are just north of Thomas's line, and manning this area was one Union brigade under the command of Colonel John Beatty. Now, Beatty wasn't really a fan of this position. He felt a lone brigade on what would have been the Union's left flank couldn't really hold this area. But he was assured that there would be reinforcements. Now, to orient you, here is the John McDonald Field. Would have been a farm at the time of the battle. And back this way would have been Thomas's line. Now, Thomas's line would have been through these trees on the other side of this field here. And then you had Beatty's brigade, who would have essentially been the left flank of the Union Army on September 20th of 1863. So like we said, he wasn't a fan of this position. He felt exposed. But he was assured that he would be getting reinforcements. Now, Beatty would begin to send skirmishers into the wood line here. Now, those skirmishers would make contact with thousands of Confederates from John Breckenridge's division moving directly at us. And about 9:30 in the morning, the Confederate attack begins. Now, it's important to note that this Confederate attack happened about 4 hours late. There was a handful of miscommunication issues throughout the night. Certain people weren't notified of the attack in a timely manner. So by the time you can get your men formed and in position, this attack began about 4 hours too late. But in turn, you had thousands of Confederates swarming through this wood line here, hitting that lone Union brigade who was out here exposed. And you had Brigadier General Marcellus Stovall's North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida brigade slammed right into this position here. Now, this position was held by the 104th Illinois Infantry, and they collapsed pretty quick here. So the fighting on September 20th of 1863 has begun, and now you have Union troops fleeing across the Lafayette Road here, back in this direction here.
We swept through the woods with a line of skirmishers ahead driving the Yankees like sheep. Sergeant Samuel Pascoe, 1st 3rd Florida Infantry.
Just wanted to give you another view of the position here of the 104th Illinois Infantry. So they would deploy skirmishers out into this wood line here. Those skirmishers would make contact with lead elements of John Breckenridge's division, and thousands of Confederates would be swarming through this area. So they would begin coming through this area. The visitor center wasn't here at the time, and they would begin sweeping up the Lafayette Road in this manner here. Now, before we head on to our next stop, I wanted to stop at the Florida Monument here. And just to reorient you real quick, we were just in this location covering the 104th Illinois. We mentioned that Maurice Stovall's division broke through the wood line here in this general area. Well, within Stovall's mixed brigade, you had Florida troops. You had the 1st, 3rd Florida Infantry. They were combined due to attrition as the war went on. So they combined the 1st and 3rd Florida regiments. So the 1st, 3rd, and also the 4th Florida. Now within the 1st, 3rd Florida Infantry, commanded by Colonel William Dilworth, you had Company B, called the St. Augustine Blues. Now the St. Augustine Blues were obviously from St. Augustine, Florida, which is where I currently reside. It's always pretty neat being able to come to the general area where men from your hometown fought over 160 years ago. And here I am sharing their story. And, you know, we're essentially from the same hometown, and I'm walking on the same ground that they were. Obviously, I flew by plane here and took a rental car here with some air conditioning, and they walked. And they've been fighting for years up until this point. But I wanted to stop at one of my favorite monuments on the Chickamauga battlefield here. Obviously, I may be a bit biased being from Florida, knowing that there's men from St. Augustine that fought and most likely died on this field that we're on. So here's the beautiful Florida monument. And again, Stovall's brigade would push through this area, and Breckenridge's division would begin advancing southward, I believe, because we're just north of Thomas's position. And there is a Union battery right here that was essentially left out to dry because all the infantry support was just shattered. And that's where we're headed next. Now, something that I didn't know that this sign just helped me realize is Stovall's brigade was the center of Breckenridge's division. They would advance almost 700 yards in this direction here. And Stovall's brigade, their right flank, was right here on the Lafayette Road. So just to kind of paint the picture, they are advancing straight in this direction here, all along here.
Samuel Neely, the color bearer, fell near the breastworks, and Robert McKay of the color guard close to his side both fell severely wounded, and 4 of the color company were left dead on the field. Colonel William Dilworth, 1st 3rd Florida Infantry.
All right, so we've reached our next destination here on Breckenridge's attack. So just to reorient you, we were just in this field here, the 104th Illinois. Again, they were shattered by Stovall's brigade. They fled in this general direction. And right here was a Illinois battery commanded by Captain Lyman Bridges. And his guns were positioned as you see here. So you can imagine, 1 second, you have a pretty comfortable position behind the Union front line. Beatty's brigade was out this way, and all of a sudden, you have a blue wave headed straight towards you, and behind that blue wave is a very angry and determined gray wave. So now you had Bridges' guns here essentially turned into the front line, and you had elements of Beatty's brigade essentially rallying on this position here. But again, Stovall's brigade broke through here, and they would come in this general direction here. Now, General George Thomas, his line was kind of like an arc around Kelly Field here. So this monument just right here was essentially his left flank. And then the left flank was extended in this general area with Beatty's brigade. So they were being driven back. And now you had Breckenridge's forces coming right for these guns here with little to no infantry support. So now Thomas's line is in danger. Trying to put myself in the position of one of the cannoneers here. You know, at one instant you have a pretty secure line, there's Union infantry in front of you, and in the next instant there is Confederate forces swarming towards your position. You have little to no infantry support here. So just imagine trying to load and fire this gun as fast as possible. The longer you take, the closer that Confederate infantry is getting. and now we're under rifle fire. And something to keep in mind that I always forget to think about, these guns were brought here by horses. So if you disable the horses, you can't get the guns out of here, at least not very far. So one of the things about the fighting here is Bridges Battery, they lost almost 30 horses just in this area. So again, how do you get the guns out if you don't have the horses? And that's something that you never really think about. So just imagine all the fighting here, all the bodies from both sides, and then also dozens and dozens of bodies of horses. And it's hard to imagine just how brutal and chaotic the fighting was here. And again, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it's always really eerie coming to a battlefield like this, and it's just so peaceful outside of the car noise and the beautiful views, and just imagining, you know, at one point this was probably hell on earth. So as the fighting progressed here, 2 of Bridges' guns would be captured. They were unable to get those guns out of here, like we just touched on. If you don't have any horses to get them out of here, you know, you're losing men. You're not gonna really get these guns out of here effectively. So we're being attacked from the front here, and we're being attacked on the flank here. Now, we mentioned Stovall's brigade was essentially attacking in this area just beyond the Lafayette Road here. But also coming down this road were elements of Benjamin Helm's Orphan Brigade. Now, if you don't know who Benjamin Helm is, he was the commander of the Confederate Kentucky Brigade, which was dubbed the Orphan Brigade. And married to Benjamin Helm was Emily Todd, who just happened to be the half-sister of Mary Todd Lincoln. So Benjamin Helm, fighting for the Confederacy, was Lincoln's brother-in-law. You always hear about, you know, how this war ripped apart families and divided families. Well, the president wasn't exempt from that either. And his brother-in-law was fighting here on the fields of Chickamauga. So you had the Confederate Kentucky Brigade, also known as the Orphan Brigade, attacking Thomas's line. Well, at some point in that attack, the Orphan Brigade split, and you had the 6th Kentucky and the 4th Kentucky, along with a handful of companies from the 41st Alabama, essentially making their way down this road, assisting Stovall in taking the Union works just before us here. And the elements of the Orphan Brigade would again hit the flank of Bridges Battery here. So you had Confederate forces to our front here. You had elements of the Orphan Brigade hitting us on our flank here. And holding the end of the Union line was a handful of regiments, including the 15th Kentucky. So you had Kentucky on Kentucky right here in this area before us. Now, the more I learn about this war, the more I learn how common this truly was. You know, you always had Maryland on Maryland, you have Kentucky on Kentucky. This is just an awful war. So imagine, you know, some of these guys may be neighbors. Some of these guys may be from the same hometown. And now they're shooting at each other in this general area here. Now, I want to try to clarify this battle as much as possible because it is really confusing. So we just touched on how the Orphan Brigade essentially split. You had half the brigade attacking Thomas's line. So Thomas's line would essentially run along this road, and it wraps all the way around this way here. So half of the Orphan Brigade was assaulting Thomas's line back here, and then the other half essentially made their way down this way, panning to my right. And here we touched on how you had Kentucky on Kentucky in this general area. So you had the Orphan Brigade, the Union Kentucky Regiment duking it out here, and then across the Lafayette Road here, that's Bridges Battery. That's where we just were. So again, you had Confederate forces attacking from the front, and now elements of the Orphan Brigade was hitting them on their flank here. And these Confederate forces would continue to sweep in this general direction here. Now, we touched on the Orphan Brigade. So their attack initially originated from this location here. They were back in this wood line when they received orders, and Breckinridge's attack commenced. We were in the area of where Stovall's brigade was. Well, on Breckinridge's left flank was the Orphan Brigade. So they would emerge from this wood line here and begin assaulting Union positions. So we are facing Thomas's line. You can see some of the monuments here. So the Orphan Brigade would emerge from this general area, and half the brigade would assault this general area here. And through the chaos and confusion of battle, the brigade essentially split. And those elements that helped capture Bridges' artillery would essentially advance in this direction here. So I wanted to show you where that originated, because we were about, I would say, 200 yards in that general direction. So keep in mind, as the brigade split, they're getting hit on their flank all along here from Thomas's line. And the rest of the Orphan Brigade was assaulting the line here. Now, behind this line here is Kelly Field, and that is where we're headed next. Now, fear not, we're going to cover the Orphan Brigade a little more in depth in another episode here, but I just wanted to briefly show you the area where their attack originated from and where they essentially headed, at least half the brigade. So we've moved down the Lafayette Road, so let's reorient ourselves. We were just at Bridges Battery, I would say 200 to 300 yards in that direction, and we are in a position called Kelly Field. Now, we touched on Thomas's line. Now, Thomas's line would extend all through this direction here. Now, it's important to keep in mind that his line was on the other side of that wood line here. So we touched on, you had the Orphan Brigade assaulting Thomas's line up in this general area here. Unsuccessfully, half the Orphan Brigade moved down this general direction. You had Stovall's brigade assaulting this area, and you also had the brigade under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Adams assaulting this area as well. So you had two Confederate brigades in this general area, essentially coming right down the Lafayette Road. So the Union left flank was in peril here, and they would advance into Kelly Field. So Thomas's lines are to our left through the woods here, and it kind of feels like the Confederates have victory within grasp. You have two Confederate brigades behind the Union works here, and those Union works are being assaulted from the front, and now they have Confederate forces in their rear. So right here we are in the position that was obtained by the 60th North Carolina of Stovall's brigade. So Stovall's men came right through this area, and naturally I'm curious about where the 1st, 3rd Florida Infantry was in all this. They were somewhere in this area, but you had Stovall's men essentially coming out of the wood line here. You had Adams' brigade on the other side of the Lafayette Road advancing in this general direction here. So we are in the spot of the 60th North Carolina, and as they reach this spot, keep in mind we are behind the Union lines now. The 60th North Carolina and the rest of Stovall's brigade, we have a Confederate brigade on our right for support, was advancing in this general area when all of a sudden Union troops that were ordered to lie down would rise up from the ground, deliver a volley, and essentially stun Stovall's brigade in their tracks. Now, while this was happening, you had Union forces in the woods here hitting Adams' brigade on his flank. So now you have Union troops on the Confederate flank across the Lafayette Road. Stovall's brigade was essentially just stunned by a Union volley from troops appearing out of nowhere. And now the victory that seemed so close is slipping away. So we're in the general position of the 60th North Carolina and the rest of Stovall's brigade. Just imagine emerging from this woodline behind me here. You're gonna do it. Victory's within grasp. All of a sudden, you see a line of blue infantry appear out of nowhere, deliver a volley, and essentially just drop scores of men within your own company, your regiment, and the rest of the brigade. And just think about, you know, that sway of emotions here. Right now, we're behind the Union lines. There's very little in front of us, and all of a sudden, timely Union reinforcements pop out of the ground, essentially, start hitting the other Confederate brigade on the flank, and now we just got hit with a devastating volley. And, you know, despite exchanging volleys back and forth at a rather short distance here, you can just get a sense of how demoralizing that could be, and just the complete momentum shift here at Chickamauga, which we've seen time and time again here.
For a short time, the 47th was halted in the open field under the terrible fusillade of shot and shell from batteries and rapid fire from the lines of supporting infantry. Our flagstaff was cut in two and our colors riddled. Adjutant Benjamin Williams, 47th Georgia Infantry.
The cannonading from both sides, consisting of hundreds of guns, and the constant roar of musketry was fearfully grand, deafening, and terrific. Many a poor fellow looked upon the sun with hopes and fears for the last time. Captain James Jenkins, 29th Indiana Infantry.
So one of the things I want to point out to you in this location is, although we're in a field, this field isn't completely flat. I don't know if you're like me, but when you think of a field, you automatically default to a wide open flat field. But right here, you can kind of see how it dips down, pan this way, you can kind of see it dips down again, goes back up, and then you can kind of see artillery pieces here in the distance. Well, they're on the crest of a hill here. Now I'm going to pan back to my right. We mentioned how a Union force essentially appeared out of nowhere and staggered Stovall's brigade with a volley. So you can kind of imagine, you know, it's really easy to conceal a large group of men here. And then you have Stovall's brigade, who's already been fighting up to this point for about an hour. They've covered a lot of ground, about 700 yards, and now they're staggered with a volley. And one of the regiments involved here from the Union was part of Vandevier's brigade, who was essentially coming from this direction. They hit Adams' brigade. His brigade would sweep down this way. We're standing in the location of the 2nd Minnesota, and they would be holding this spot between 10 a.m. and 12 o'clock, and they would help repulse and drive back Breckenridge's attack here. And the monument states that they would lose up to 30% of its men killed and wounded in this general area here. And I'm going to pan back to my right, and you can just kind of see we aren't that far apart. This is savage fighting here. Now, this may not be the exact locations, but it's the general areas of these units. So again, here is the 2nd Minnesota here, and you had Stovall's brigade, and there's the 60th North Carolina where we just were previously. Although victory was within grasp here for the Confederacy, Breckinridge's division was spent up until this point. Think about, they've advanced almost 1,000 yards, taking numerous casualties, and thanks to timely reinforcements here, their advance was blunted here, and they would have to pull back. And although victory was within grasp, it slips away once again, and it just seems like at times this battle is just never going to end here.